started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Neil Stetson, and I'm sure everybody knows Mick. And it's kind of unusual, maybe, for two pastors to have two aliases. Maybe that doesn't speak well of us. This is Skip and Mick. So Mick's going to start out by telling a story.
You know, what's gathered us here is a lot of the kind of arguments and stuff that are going on in Heath, but we're not here to have them. I just want to give you a warning about that. But what we are here to do is to, well, I'm going to call it this. We're here to enrich our neighboring so that we have a richer context to the community conversations that happen among us. It's the best we can think of to do. But I don't know about you, but I was born in Ohio, and say again? Oh, good. And I was born in Ohio, and I never heard the term neighbor used as a verb until I came to Heath. And soon after I came to Heath, which was in 1970, as the pastor here and over in Rowe, Fred Lively had a heart attack. And he was one of the few remaining dairy farmers here. And I don't know if you know these numbers, but I've heard that in the 50s there were still maybe 50 dairy farms in Heath. But they were not things anybody made any money off of. They were subsistence farms mostly. Some people made money, but not many. But by the time I came, there were 11 in 1970, and when I left there were 6, and a couple of years later there were none. That's kind of part of the story we're going to unfold here. But Fred Lively had a heart attack, and somebody had to take care of his cows, and so the other dairy farmers that were left in town stood up to take care of him. And I made the mistake of saying, I think it might have been to Skip's dad, who was one of the dairy farmers who was still here. I made the mistake of saying, it's great how you're helping Fred. And he said, help is humiliation. He said, we are neighboring. First time I ever heard of it, but neighboring as a verb is a really important kind of thing. And so, and I think that standing aside and not being a part of the conversations that are happening, the fact that people in town don't know each other very well now is a big factor in how these conversations are unfolding. And so what we would like to do is just tell the stories of our coming here. This is today. Why'd we come here? What keeps us here? What we have loved, what we have hated, that type of thing. But we're not going to talk about those issues. Gotcha? And we will say no if you stand up to do it, we'll tell you. But we're going to talk about ourselves here as neighbors. And so I want to tell you this. When I first came here, it was in summer of 1970, this place was full of theologians. And so that's what I first experienced when I came, and it was really exciting for me. These were people who had been my teachers, who had read and all this type of thing. And then came the 1st of September, and they were all gone. And I was confronted by the heathens. And it was really something. But one of the first things I felt, I was having to find my way. There's two things that emerged for me in that first year. One is that the pulpit was no longer a bully as a speaking place, but what it was a bully listening post, a feeling post of what was going on in the community. And so the first thing I felt when I came, and it was noticeable, was grief. It took me a while to name it, but I was feeling this. And I want to remind you, too, that the last people who had lived in Heath as a farming community were dying. The men were all gone. The fathers were all gone. There were 4 mothers left. Hannah Burrington, Ruth's mom, Grace Lanston, Edie Gleason, and who was the say again? Belle Dickinson, that's right. Those 4 women were the matriarchs of the town. and they were still left, and that was where I was kind of feeling what I was feeling, was a matter of grief, because they were the last generation to live in Heath as it was. We are all the ones who are bringing the new Heath. And I got known as that hippie minister. So, that was going on. There's just one more thing I want to say, if I can remember it. I'm an old guy. Oh, shoot. Well, I'll think it. You're all going to have a chance to talk, but now I'm done. I want to just come again to the thing. What we're doing here is trying to enrich our neighboring by sharing the experience of each other of Heath. So, anyway, you come.
Okay. When Mick and I talked about this whole concept, we were kind of puzzled as to what direction we should take, and then we suddenly realized in my shop one day we were talking, and we suddenly realized that all we have to do is tell our story, and that pretty much tells everybody's story in Heath, and that is, I represent a very different planet than Mick does. Somebody from away, that was strange in the 60s, and other than the summer people. And so that was the context that I grew up in, and Mick showed up on the scene, and he was very different. And he was, in my tradition, one of those people on the far left that you couldn't trust anything that he said. And he, in meeting me, think, oh, he's one of those fighting fundamentalists. We just don't want to have anything to do with them. And so we kind of coexisted. We bumped into each other a little bit. But then, I don't even remember when it began, but we kind of ended up getting forced to be together. And as we were together, we started learning about each other. And we suddenly realized that we really like each other. We don't agree on a lot of things, but we enjoy the interchange of ideas and even a debate between us. And so I just want to share that today as a context for what we're all about. We all come from different places. We all have different backgrounds, different origins, different ways of thinking, different investments in the community, if you will. But the one thing we all have in common is we all are from Heath. Some are forced to be from Heath, as I was. I was dragged here from Greenfield Hospital in 1947, and then left for a time and back, and Mick chose to come from Ohio. But the point is, we're all here. And one of the things that I remember the most about Heath as a child growing up was some of the cantankerous meetings that took place, whether it was here in church, whether it was down at the community hall. I can remember a lot of hollering, a lot of yelling, but somehow when the meeting was over, the people that were yelling at each other walked down and had a cup of coffee together. And so I think that's kind of what's happened to Mick and I, and it's our hope that we can somehow capture this as heathens. So, Mick?
Yeah, I got one more thing to say.
Sure.
I remembered what I forgot. And that it was being at town meetings in the early 70s when things, in fact, were changing very quickly. And they were pretty rugged meetings. But we still had Howard Dickinson and Howard Thompson here. One of the things that communities once did, real communities, they would generate the characters they needed to save themselves. One of the characters was the character of the fool. And Howard Thompson particularly was our town fool. And when I said that at his memorial service, one of the guys who was with me, one of the old heathens, was really mad at me for calling Howard a fool, but he was the kind of fool, if you read Shakespeare, he was that kind of fool. And then Howard Dickinson with him. And so one of the things that would happen at town meetings when they'd start to get pretty rough, which they did, is that they'd be standing on one would stand on one wall and one would stand on the other wall, and they'd start yelling across the room to each other. Talking, laughing, all this kind of thing. And who was the name? Who was the moderator? He was also a summer person who'd come to Ed Calver, and he would say, "Shut up, shut up." He said, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to call the marshal." And they just kept going and kept going, and when they were done, the problem was over. They were saving the town. And one of the things we don't produce anymore, I mean, there may be some foolish people here, I'm sure, but we don't produce the people we need to kind of hold things together, because we're not a community anymore. We're a group of people who live in the same place and love it. That's the end of my story. So I would like to invite anybody else who wants to tell about coming to Heath to come up. Art, come and tell us.
They say if you're first in line, you want to be last.
Yeah.
Well, this is a different kind of a forum than I expected. I came in 1973 to Heath with Carol, and we were, well, actually 74. In 73, we came and settled on the Davenport farm in Shelburne, in the cottage on the way up to the fire tower. And we we house sat with the Goldwassers over in Ashfield at the Puripan Tree Farm while they were in Pohnpei in the South Pacific. And we were looking for land, Carol and I, to try out our relationship. We liked living in Ashfield, even though it was a real short time. Both of us from kind of suburban areas. Carol from La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I from Kensington, Maryland, outside Washington, D.C. And there were elements of where I grew up that were like Heath, or I should say it the other way. Heath became a little bit like where I grew up, because everybody in my little suburban community of 5 or 6 blocks, all the families had kids, and all the kids played with the other kids and treated the neighbors' houses like their own, and the parents treated their neighbors' kids as their own in terms of safety and activities and that sort of thing. So everybody knew everybody, just in a 3 or 4 block area around my house. And anyway, I didn't know anything about that when I moved to Heath, but we were really just looking for a place to get away from what had become big city stuff, including where I grew up, where that community didn't exist anymore because of the change in the population and the change in the houses. They were ritzy houses now instead of small middle-class family houses. Anyway, we were looking for land and going to build our own houses and our own house, and then we were with the Goldwassers and Lynn and Charlie Miller, now Lynn Perry, and we bought the farm that Skip grew up in the Stetson farm, and we settled in there, all 6 of us, 7 of us actually, with Lark. I guess he was 6 or 7 years old at that point, for the summer, with the intention of each of us building our own house. No one ever considered what was going to happen to the big farmhouse, because we each had our own plan for a separate house, but 2 of those happened, and the farmhouse became Carol's and mine. But what I wanted to say about that related to the neighboring is that we also were probably seen as, and maybe Skip can tell you, but we were seen as possible commune people, hippies, whatever. They said, yes, that's we weren't hippies, we were just hippie-like. We bought the farm as tenants in common, again, planning to split up the farm between ourselves, which we eventually did do. But no one complained about us being hippie-like, and we were accepted right away, actually, and as we met people, we really liked people. They were very different in politics and social ideas than we, most of them. Some weren't, some were. But they were neighbors, and they were helpful when we needed help, and we were helpful to them as they needed it. The Gallipos lived next door, and I helped shovel out their driveway when it was snowing sometimes, before anybody could get there with a plow, so that they could get out. And I never asked whether I should do that. I just did it. And when we had our house fire in 1996, a huge outpouring of, I'm skipping a whole thing here, but neighbors came to help. And the Cromacs, who lived down the road from us, Bruce Cromac and his wife came over and just dumped a $100 bill in my hand and said, use this however you want. And I'm going to take a little bit more time just to say that when Bruce Cromac decided to sell the piece of land across the road from him, he had it surveyed, and I didn't know he was selling it. I didn't know anything about it. We were good neighbors, although we posted our land no hunting, and so that made him mad from the day one. But I always used to get together with Bruce and Olin Whipple when the hunters got together each fall at Olin's house. And so we just never talked about the no hunting part of it. I'm not opposed to hunting, but we just didn't want to post our land. I mean, we did want to post our land. Anyway, when he was getting ready to sell his land, he apparently had it surveyed, and I was walking through the woods and went past the corner of the land up on the ridge, up on the ridge. And I noticed that there was a new pin at the corner, and it was 3 feet or so from the end of a very nicely built up stone wall, which came up from Bruce's property and ended right at the border. And they'd moved some of those rocks at the end over to where the pin was, whoever did it. Well, I was kind of upset because even though it was only 3 feet or so, over a distance, it was, well, I just didn't like the idea that somebody moved the corner without checking with me, especially when it was onto my land. So I didn't know what to do, so I went to Olin Whipple. And I said what the situation was, and I said, what do you think I should do? And Olin Whipple, who was always very wise, said, well, you should make a decision as to whether or not you want that land back the way it's supposed to be or whether you want a good neighbor. And I never talked to Bruce about it. I still haven't. I haven't talked to John Mooney or anybody about it, but that's the way I left it. And Bruce and Catherine and the kids are good friends and good neighbors. So I didn't command the whole session here, so I'm going to sit down. But anyway, I like living in Heath, and up until now anyway, Heath liked us living here.
So we need somebody else. We got to hear you.
Well, I'll tell a story of coming to Heath and then things that really attract me and keep me here. You'll hear some very similar threads to threads that Art just shared. I first came to Heath as a summer person. I was not theologically related, but the house that my parents owned came from Bishop Gilbert. And there was another bishop across the way in the Wolf's house. And there was another bishop right across the street in the house that Sheila and I now live in. So we had lots of clergy around, but we weren't. But I really enjoyed it. We were growing up in the middle of Westchester County. If you know where the Cross Westchester Expressway is, that's the great big road that leads to what was then the Tappan Zee Bridge. There was a little kid. I lived in a place on just the south of it, and later in my life, just to the north of it. So this was very different. very different. And I liked it. The pace, the trees, the nature was wonderful. Not long after Sheila and I were married, we were able to get our hands on the house we now currently live in and have for 45 years. And then I began to realize that, oh, gee, there is something more here than just trees. And you can go to the Heath Fair in the summer, that's fun, but since I live here, I can help out. I quickly found out that, this young guy who grew up in the middle of Westchester County, New York, was completely accepted and teamed right up. Actually, at first I was working with both of the Dickinsons, Howard and Ralph, in the parking lot. And we'd get together a couple of days before the fair, lay out the parking lot, and after we got that all organized and ready, we'd sit down in the shade of that maple tree up at the entrance and just chat and visit. So you couldn't find people of more different ages and backgrounds, and yet got along just fine. And I found that experiences like that at the fair continued. After being here for a little bit longer, I joined the volunteer fire department. Now, the stereotype of a volunteer firefighter is not someone with a master's degree in education. So what? Most of the volunteer firefighters worked all the time and worked on farms, worked in agriculture. Didn't matter. We had a shared purpose. And that's what we focused on, and that's what we did. Oddly enough, at one point in time, that volunteer fire department had 3 guys on it with master's degrees in education. Unheard of. I'm so sorry, it's just too weird. So what? Once the tones went off, we're all the same. We're all working on the same goal. Many of us were at Arts Fire, unfortunately. Maybe fortunately we were there, but unfortunately it happened. And again, that experience of a community that didn't matter if you were different. So what? We had a common goal. We were working together. So I just think that's something that keeps me interested and something that I really value that the town of Heath has had, and I think still can. Thanks.
Who go next? Okay.
Hi, I'm Gloria Fisher, for who doesn't know me. I live on South Road in Heath, and I went to UMass in 1969, and once I came out to Western Massachusetts, I came from Natick near Boston. I thought, I'm never going to leave. This is where I belong. This is just beautiful. And I looked at my mother. I said, how come no one ever told me about this? And so after my college journey, I met this man who grew up in Conway, and we lived in Plainfield, which was really not the most pleasant experience in 1972 for someone with really long hair and a beard, and then me. And I was like, okay. Then we moved to Holly. Holly was really nice, really fairly neutral, but very nice. Then we came to Heath after driving around, and I live next to what used to be the Mountaintop Lodge, but so I like Heath. You can just feel it once you cross the border. It just like releases your soul or something. It was the best feeling. So we said, okay, we want to live in Heath. The people there are so kind. The vibe is so good. And we bought this little cabin, is a nice word, and fixed it up. And boy, we didn't look like everybody else in town. At that point anyway, it was 1974. And I worked at UMass, and we lived on the edge of town, so I didn't even get to see too many people. But, bless Walt Gleason's heart. He saved our butts a million times without even blinking, just loving it. And since my former husband grew up in Conway, he had that country thing of like, oh, there's someone in need. Yes, let's go help him. And that we experienced that coming both back and forth. And it's like, yeah, this is my chosen place. This is where I love to live. I'd come home from UMass, and the minute I hit the dump, I'd go, I'm home. And you could just feel it. So, after leaving UMass, after retiring from UMass, I'm like, okay, now I actually get to live in Heath and not just sleep here. And I just jumped in and did a bunch of different stuff. And this is just a great town. And I love the way that when I first moved here, all I kept thinking was, boy, this is a bunch of really cool people. They live here. They sort of get not quite invaded, but sort of invaded by the hippie back to earth people, some of whom don't even know what they're doing. And everybody seemed accepting. And it was basically live and let live as long as you don't do anything to hurt anyone else. And I loved that, and I still do. Anyway, so after 48 years of living in Heath, I'm still really happy that we made that decision so long ago.
Good morning, Bob Gruen, a neighbor to the church, and was from the moment we moved in. My wife Susan and I lived in New York City, which is quite a difference. And I had always lived in an apartment. I was an apartment kid. Susan was a house kid. And we got married, and I said, okay, I got a nice apartment, and she liked it, but was determined and twisted my arm and said, 5 years and we get a house. Okay, I'm young, I'll say yes to my wife about anything, In fact, I still do, but anyway, that's another whole story. So New York back in the 70s, for those of you who don't remember, was a bit in trouble. It was a tough town, and we had our daughter Heather, and determined that we didn't want her to grow up in New York. We wanted her to be able to run around and maybe even have a pony. Thank God I never got a pony, but that's another story too. So we went out looking, and one weekend we were in Boston. We figured we'd look around Boston. So we started looking at houses in Lexington and went, no, can't afford that, and went all around Boston. There just wasn't anything that we could really afford. So we took to the road. We said, oh, the Mohawk Trail, I've heard about that. So we rode along the Mohawk Trail. We stopped in Leominster, and that didn't appeal to us. We stopped in Greenfield, it was very nice, and then we went to Shelburne Falls, and there was a real estate agent who was open on a Sunday and took us to see 3 houses. The third house we saw was the house next door, and they hooked us. We came in, they had the fire going, there was an apple pie in the oven. And Susan said, what do you think? And I was like, well, yeah, it's really nice. And so we went home to New York. And about a week later, it was during the World Series, I remember that, there was a call. And of course, I'm watching the Yankees in the World Series, don't disturb me. And Susan answered it, and she came in and she said, oh, it's the real estate agent. I said, yeah. And she said, well, he offered a price. And I said, no, I'm sorry, that's too high. And he dropped the price $5,000, which back then was a giant chunk of change. And so I said, okay. And that's how we bought a house, We had to ask them for directions to get back here because we didn't know how to get here. We just bought it and said, well, we'll find our way. So Heather was 3 at the time. Well, she turned 3 the week we came here. So we pack up from Brooklyn, off we go. We get here, we unload, and it just happened to be July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial. And here are these new people in town, and suddenly, right outside our house, is this gigantic party celebration going on. And one of the things that was happening was the fire department was there with a bucket brigade. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. So I went over, and I was standing there watching, and Tim Henderson came up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Tim Henderson. Are you the new people in the house?" I said, "Yes." And I introduced myself, and I introduced Susan. And I said, "Wow, this is really cool, the fire department doing a bucket brigade." He said, "You should join." And I was like, oh, you know, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a fireman, but, you know, I don't know anything about it. He said, "That's okay, just come." So I said, "Well, okay." And he said, "In fact, I am going to stop by next weekend, and you can jump right in." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Walt Gleason's barn burned, and they're having a barn raising, and everybody's helping out." And I said, "Oh, okay." Now remember, I'm an apartment kid. So we get to Walt Gleason's barn, and Tim's with me, and he says, "Okay, our job is the roof." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, we're going up on the roof." I mean, basically I knew a hammer from a screwdriver, but not a whole lot more than that. And so up I went on the roof, my heart pounding the whole time along with the hammer, you know. And I survived. And then I started going to meetings. Like Budge said, what do I know about being a firefighter? And next thing you know, you learn, and you go out, and you go to fires. And from that, I began to meet lots of other people in town. And as Budge said, farmers, people who worked at the nuclear power plant, teachers with masters in education. And somehow, as crazy as that seemed, everybody just, it was hand in glove. You just worked together. And it was a great feeling. And my kids grew up here, and it was like Budge said, living in, or Art said, living in the city. Kids just came together. You watched other people's kids. They watched your kids. You never worried. It was a real community, and still is, and I still love it. And so here we are, all those years later, and still every day I get up and I step outside and smell the clean air and say, wow, it ain't New York.
I'm Sheila Litchfield, and I just wanted to talk about a couple really cool things that happened in Heath that made us feel really, really welcome here. One is that with Deb Porter, I started the Heath Preschool. It feels like 100 years ago now. But this was a time when Heath had a lot more young families than we do right now. And in our preschool, which actually started in Deb's house and then later moved to the community hall in the basement and then wonderfully moved up to the Jacobs Road building when the school was built. But in any event, the Heath Preschool was a fabulous, fabulous place where families gathered. And we all had certainly a commonality in the fact that we had kids that were that age. In one of the classes, we actually had 18 boys. There were only 3 girls, unfortunately, in that particular group. But these 18 boys, some of you have kids in that particular group and know what I'm talking about. But these 18 kids, several of them became artists. And there was a wonderful Heath Artists program up at the community hall where they came back to Heath and showed their art. But in any event, these 18 boys went all over the world, some of them living in other countries, some of them still do. But when they come back to the United States, this is where they come. They feel that they have a root here that I feel all of us as their community have given them. And it's just the most heartwarming thing. A lot of them gather, as soon as Colin Gruen comes back into town, that's where they go. They know Colin's back, they show up there. But in any event, so there's this thing that still happens with these boys, even if they're not physically here, they're here in our hearts, and in their minds, they are still part of Heath. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Heath Gourmet Group. Now, some years ago, let's see, the Heath Gourmet Group was founded in 1981. So for 40 plus years here, we've been having this Heath Gourmet Group. But it got started in a couple different ways. First off, some of us realized that we were bumping into each other at Food Mart at the time. Big Y was Food Mart, okay. So we would just connect and see each other in the aisles and stop and visit for a long time, and then look at each other and say, why don't we just like get together and sort of, really actually sit down and have a meal together. And then there was one of the historical buildings was open, and so we happened to gather there, and again said, this is crazy. We should just meet and sit down and plan some kind of way that we can gather and on a regular basis instead of these haphazard, just kind of wonderful gatherings. But just let's do this on a regular basis. So we met, talked about it. Heath Gourmet Group was founded, and we meet every single month. And we rotate around to different homes. And we have not served just ourselves. We actually have served the Heath community. There have been events such as the Bicentennial or a garden party at the Manse a long time ago, where the Gourmet Group actually provided hors d'oeuvres and petit fours and such. The only thing that has stopped the Heath Gourmet Group is Heath Fair. We never meet in August. And the second thing is the pandemic. We couldn't meet during the pandemic. The whole piece about needing to have the mask on and not being able to take it off even to eat. Even our churches don't do social hour with food anymore and that sort of thing. But we're finding that it's coming back. We're going to be able to do it again. And we do have a plan to gather, and I can't wait to see these people that I just absolutely love and want to reconnect with without wearing a mask and actually sit and enjoy a meal together. And there are many, many, many opportunities in Heath to do that. Our fire department has pancake suppers, spaghetti suppers, that sort of thing. We can do that, and that's where we all find our common ground as well, and we are rekindling that, and where we can invite new people to participate in those sorts of things. So let's keep it up.
I'm Victoria Burrington, and I'm from away. I first heard that term from my husband, Fred. And my family was an Air Force family, so we moved around a lot. I married Fred Burrington, and he always talked about Heath. Anybody who knows Fred, he's a great storyteller, and I feel very much a heathen because I feel like I've been steeped in Heath just from being around Fred. And I remember the first fair he took me to. The first thing I remember is that I couldn't believe how cold it was in August. I was unprepared. And then Fred kept introducing me to his cousins, just over and over again, everybody was his cousin. And the thing that was really neat about that for me is I come from a huge extended family. My father's father had 8 brothers and sisters, and his mother had 7 brothers and sisters. They were farmers in the West, in Oregon and Idaho, and they emigrated from the Basque Country in Spain. So family was huge. It was very important. And even though we weren't around the family much, whenever we were, it was just this huge glob of cousins that was really wonderful, and it was something that I looked forward to, and that was something that made Heath feel very special to me, is the feeling of family. The cousin term gets kind of extended a little bit through marriage and, you know, all of that, but that's one of the things that I have absolutely loved about Heath, is the feeling of family and the neighboring. The neighboring is a wonderful thing. And so that's one of the parts of Heath that I love the most.
Thank you.
I'm Don Freeman. Live on 23 Avery Brook Road. Everybody's house always gets referred to as by the name of the former owner. So we live in the Howland House. Margaret and I first came to Heath almost 21 years ago, almost to the day. We were visiting UMass, where I taught for a number of years. And we had decided we were going to retire. And so we spent some of our time here with real estate agents. And we came up here, and like many people around here, I have a long connection to this part of the world. I went to Mount Hermon School when it was Mount Hermon School, and then my years at UMass. And of course, I had never heard of Heath, Massachusetts. And we parked across the way here, and having seen the Howland House, and took a deep breath, and something profound settled in me. I've never been able to explain it. You know, the New England poet Robert Frost wrote, "Home is the place that when you have to go there, they have to take you in." And that's what it felt like. And that initial feeling always stood up through the years, you know, with the ins and the outs and the disagreements about this and that and the other. Nothing ever touched that. And I like to think that that's sort of generally true for many people in this town. So I both have deep roots here and didn't have any roots at all when I showed up. I'm a native of Boston. You know, forgive me. But this town has a kind of center to it that's like no community, including New York City, where I've also lived, that I know. It's remarkable how this has been able to be sustained through many years. I am, for better or for worse, mostly for better, married to a British woman who ironically educated my taste in early American houses. And the first house we owned was a 1770 Cape in the picturesque town of Athol many years ago. I won't tell you all the Athol jokes, none of it being a church. Yeah, right. So when we came here, and we looked at the Howland House again, and I kind of walked out the kitchen door and looked at this incredible view we have down across our front yard and across the river valley to the hills on the other side. And we kind of looked at each other and we said, this is the place. and it's always been the place. And I don't think we'll ever lose that here. I know that Margaret and I will not.
I'm Elisa Villaringo. I'm the youngest daughter of Bob and Del Villaringo, who have made Heath our family home for 32 years. I had a lot of great ideas when I was sitting in the pew, and let's see if I can actually get them out now that I'm standing here. I'm probably the newest comer to Heath in this room. My husband Billy and I moved here 2 years ago from northern New Jersey. Billy was getting ready to retire, and we were looking for a place kind of in upstate New York, Catskills area. And anytime we would go look at a town, we kept comparing it to Heath, saying these are the qualities that we're looking for in a town. We wanted to be on the small side, country with land, and definitely a community setting where we could participate, where we could belong, where we could start our life together now that our collective children were off on their own and running their own lives. So this was a time for Billy and I to kind of start again. And we just kept on comparing it to Heath and Heath. And one day we're, walking around Plover Hill and we're like, Heath, why don't we move to Heath? So we were lucky enough to find the perfect place just down the road from my parents. If you don't know, we own the old Tripp Blueberry Farm on Taylor Brook. We are not blueberry farmers. We had no intention of being blueberry farmers, but the house was perfect. And as I'm hearing from many of you, that when you walked onto the property of the home that you now own, you fell in love. And we sure did. I think the listing came up, and I think within 24 that we were aware of it, and within about 24 hours, my entire family's in this house walking around, and we all had the same reaction was, we need to own this home. So it was a very strong emotion to the property, again, but we didn't know anything about farmers. So, but as soon as we owned the home, that's where the neighboring started. We had people just show up telling us stories of Jake and Alicia Tripp and telling us ideas about how to restore the blueberry farms. And then in came Andrew and Meredith from the Benson Place, and now which they have just so lovingly and perfectly begun the restoration of the farm. So we were so thrilled to restore that part of the history of Heath, because the history of Heath is also something that we really fell in love with. Again, having this be our family home center for 32 years, we've gotten to know so much of what's gone on in the town and heard about all these people through stories. But as soon as we showed up, you guys showed up. And sorry, this is hard without my mom. We were so lucky to walk into a community that was waiting for us. And it's the neighboring that I think I love the most. And on some of the all of the projects that I've worked on, the collaboration of working with different people and hearing ideas and working together and as a community, as in a team, it's been so moving these past 2 years for a variety of reasons. Every one of you that I meet, you're good people, you're exciting, you have amazing stories, and I want to meet everybody in Heath. I want to know you all, so I'm really thankful for this opportunity to hear all the different stories. Neighboring is something that I think my parents instilled in our family as we were growing up, so it's something that just helps make Heath feel like home, because we get to do that here and it's not weird. In northern New Jersey, when you go knock on somebody's door and say something, hey, I noticed your lawnmower's broken, can I help you? They don't back up and say, what? So it's nice to be able to do that naturally and live naturally in this community. So I'm really, really grateful for that, and just happy to be here and be a part of the community and keep it moving forward. So.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Bill Fontes. Lisa is my wife, thankfully. So she told a lot of the story. I spent 54 years in North Jersey and 20 minutes outside of Manhattan. Very different from here. And we came to Heath, like Elisa was saying, we were looking around and we finally got hit with a 2x4 and said, why not Heath? So we came to Heath. And it's been an experience, that's for sure. You know, it's the people in Heath have been wonderful, and the only thing I have to really add to Elisa is my experience has been that I have been accepted in my life as much as I'm willing to accept. So when I reach my hand out, usually somebody puts their hand out too, and that's been my experience here too. And I've been lucky enough to be involved got involved with the broadband shortly after we got here, and that's been a great experience for me. But that's not the whole story, you know. I mean, I've tried to help when I can and use some of the things that I've been able to acquire talents in my life and help people here, and it's been reciprocated. So, you know, that's really what I wanted to add, was that my experience has been that, you know, I've been accepted as much as I'm willing to accept someone else. So that's it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Barbara Gordon, and my husband David and I live in the Hanson House on Avery Brook Road. And I think our story in coming here began a long time ago when I took a residential weaving class with Becky Ashenden at Vav Stuga in Shelburne. And I had an extraordinary experience there of community and neighboring. I felt as though I was on Mr. Rogers, and who from the neighborhood would show up each day in the studio to offer to fix something, or with an idea, or just for a cup of coffee. And I spent a lot of time walking in that area off of Bassett Road in Shelburne, and driving around the hill towns, which were new to me despite being born in Massachusetts and raised farther east, and living in the greater Springfield area for 30 years. And I came home and I said, this is where we need to be. We need to be in this area. And of course, we couldn't do it then. We were well into our working lives and child-rearing lives. And it took us many years, but we did finally make an earnest attempt to relocate to Franklin County. And so it started out as a search for the right house through the internet mostly, but also driving around and driving with a realtor one time. And we spent about 4 years intermittently visiting, looking. And then a house came on the market, the Hanson House. Nothing like anything we'd ever lived in before. And it just spoke to me. We came and we visited the house. It seemed terribly overpriced, and certainly beyond what our budget was. But it really spoke to me. And the fact that it had an attached studio, which used to accommodate 2 concert grand pianos for the Hansons, who were professional pianists. And I could certainly imagine my weaving studio there. That helped. But I didn't want to rush into any decisions. We had become very, very disillusioned with our community, where we'd been living for 30 years. Maybe it wasn't the right community for us to begin with, but it certainly had changed since we had entered, and our neighborhood had changed. And there wasn't much neighboring going on. And what little neighboring we were trying to do was not well received. So we didn't rush into any decisions. We did a real slow burn on even making an offer on the house. I think we saw it in October, and we never made an offer until late December, right before Christmas. But in the meantime, I started investigating Heath. because we didn't want to just buy a house. We wanted to retire into a community that resonated for us. I started attending select board meetings at Community Hall. And Gloria probably doesn't even remember. But the first time I attended, for one thing, there was a snowstorm. At least up here there was. Once you got to Route 2, there wasn't. And I was the only person in the audience. And partway through the meeting, Gloria came up to me and introduced herself, shook my hand, asked my name. She wondered if I was a reporter from the Recorder, because I was taking some notes. And she said, you know, it's just us. Why don't you come up and join us at the table, at the select board table? You don't need to be out here all alone. Come sit with us where we can talk. And introduced me to the other select board members at the time, which I believe were Brian and Robin, I think. And the town coordinator, who at that time was, yes, it was Kara. And they welcomed me, they asked me a little bit about myself. And then they said, we're gonna, do our business, but if you have any questions, please speak up, let us know. And they went through, and I don't even remember what all was on the agenda, but they went through a lot of issues, including things that they all recognized they did not have enough information or experience to deal with effectively. And they talked about, well, we could talk to this person at this town or that select person at that town, and maybe they could better inform us how to handle this. And each time they'd hit a new subject, they would ask me, would you like to hear the background on this? Or do you understand what we're talking about? Can we help you to understand this conversation? And I just was blown away. So the next time I came up to Heath to deliver something to a friend of mine who had just moved here, I was accosted in the town center by Jane Dane. She got in front of my car and said, stop, stop. I rolled down my window and she said, who are you? I'm Jane Dane. And she said, are you our new neighbor? Because I was driving a car that looked like the person who had moved in near them. And I said, no, but I might want to be, because we were still thinking about the Hanson house. And she said, oh, well, do you know about Heath? Do you know that this is absolutely the best town in the universe? And she was telling me about the Historic Society and the Dining with History and this and that and the other. And she said, I hope you'll come. We'd love to have you. And again, I was like, this is the kind of community that we want to be a part of. A community where people know most people, people identify someone who they don't know and welcome them, and a local government that's interested in working with their neighbors and is concerned about bringing people up to speed. I just was thrilled. And so we did ultimately end up buying the house and moving in. And as soon as we arrived, people just couldn't do enough for us. Ken Gilbert, across the street from us, first time the power went out, David was working. I was down the valley trying to sell our other house. Came home and he was running down the hill saying, Barbara, Barbara, the power's out. Can I start your generator for you? I was like, wow. This is exactly what we want, what we were hoping for. Not just to receive, but also to give and have it be received. After years of being rebuffed, it was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. And we're now finishing our 4th year here. And it's home. It really has been home, and it's still home. It's not perfect. There's no perfect place, but we love it here. We love the country. We love our neighbors. We love the community. And we have participated. I think it was Bob Viorengo who asked David on one of our first social meetings with him, "So, what are you going to volunteer for?" And he's pestered us repeatedly, and we have responded. We have responded. I was on the Board of Health. I'm still the Cultural Council chair. David has been an elected official on the Municipal Light Board and participating in the Heath Fair. It's been wonderful, and we'd like it to continue to be wonderful, and we're happy to do what we can to reinforce that, to work with it instead of against it. Thank you.
Amazing. I'm a Mets fan, by the way. In case, huh? For very good reason. I mean, I feel like I almost want to say my whole entire life has transpired here. I'm so glad that I waited to speak, because everyone who speaks, I know you all. I can even say I love you all. You've been my life here. And we arrived, let's see, when was it? It was 71, and I was pregnant with my second son, Arlo, whom Mick saved his life once in the little pond in the woods down in the woods near our house. Arlo had jumped in and disappeared, and we were all there skinny dipping because we were hippies. And Mick ran in and pulled him out, and so that was that story. But I came from the city, from New York, and we arrived here because we were living on the Lower East Side, and there was a sculptor who had a show in Northampton or East Hampton and wanted help bringing his sculpture up, and had asked us if Charles, not me, if Charles could help him lift these heavy sculptures, and we would come up to Massachusetts, and we knew nothing about this part of the world, but sure, we'd love to come. And we took wonderful drives through the little back roads, and someone said, you know, this is just, I mean, they didn't even have to tell us just how beautiful it is. And I guess that's what we were drawn to in this part of the world, was just the beauty and nature. And so initially we started out in a little cabin in Ashfield, and from there we stayed there from June until October. We rented this little cabin, and we did it one summer, and then we did it the next summer, and at that point we knew we wanted to live here. And so someone said, well, you know, there's this place in Heath, you might want to go have a look. And we drove up to Heath, and, you know, up, one of the highest places in the area. And someone else, Olin, we stopped at Olin Whipple's house, Olin and Ruth, and asked if they knew of any land. And they said, well, you know, if you go check with Will Rainville, he has something. And so we knocked on their door, and Will said, yeah, I have my dump down the road. I'd be willing to part with that, and I'll give you some land with it. So we drove just down the road and looked across the field, and we saw Mount Greylock. It was just incredibly beautiful. So what, you know, there was an upside-down school bus, there were refrigerators, there's junk all over the property, and we had some of it taken away and some of it buried, and we went ahead. Charles built our house. We bought, we didn't have much money, but I'll confess that his brother lent us some. And he had just, that was just, I guess, the beginning of his career. So he had some money. And he lent us some to buy lumber and all of that, and we had some people helping us, some young people. I was 31 at the time, and we lived in, where is Jan? Jan Leaf? We lived in the house, there you are, across the road from you, where Dana and John, that's where we started out in Heath. And so Charles was building, and eventually time was going by, and Arlo went to the little preschool, and I just remember how, I mean, the whole thing is like a dream. You know, coming from New York, never having been in a little New England village before, or town, it's not even a village. I mean, it was just, and we were definitely hippies. I remember going to the first town meeting wearing a long blue Mexican skirt, a red cummerbund, and a white peasant blouse. And it just seemed like the normal thing to wear, and everyone was just kind of looking at me. You know, there were all these, I don't know, I just felt like very much out of place. But in time, it all started to feel super comfortable. We started the food co-op up here, where we'd have I don't even remember all the people who were involved with it, but we'd have a mimeograph sheet, and each person would take one, and you'd put the order in, and then sometime during the month, you would, 2 or 3 weeks later, you'd go to someone else's house, and it would get divvied up, and then you'd pick up your, I don't know, 50 pounds of flour. We made our own bread in those days and our own yogurt. I mean, we were really back to the basics and going back to the earth. We had big gardens, and I became friends with lots of people all over Franklin County who were doing the same thing. So I was sort of part of other groups as well. But at this point in time, it's so huge to try and sum it up, but it's amazing to me to be standing here, to be talking about my life here. And Charles died in 1993. So it's been exactly 30 years. And this whole place was completely full. It was February 8th when I think that we were actually here. Mick was one of the people who was helping us through. It just sort of gives me it's just incredible to think of it, that all that time and what it all meant to me. It's really been a remarkable part of my life, and I'm extremely grateful. I really am. The way I participated tended to be more, not so much right in Heath, but I practiced acupressure in Shelburne Falls, and I taught yoga in Heath and at the Rose School and at Mohawk. And I taught mindfulness and meditation. I still am part of 2 meditation groups. One is in Shelburne Falls, and the other one's a Zoom group. And I was part of a group called, we were studying sociocracy. And that's something, not really even having any idea about what the issues are right now in town. I haven't been part of it. It's a way of solving problems, meeting with your neighbors. And it's just very effective. And I would be totally happy if anyone wants to talk to me about it. And if they'd be interested in learning more, maybe we could start something like that here. I'd be happy to share my knowledge of it. So I think I'm going to sum it up, but the community is really, it's all important. I lived my whole childhood and growing up was in a New York apartment and in Europe. I lived in Europe a good 7 years of my life. And I didn't have any community. I never knew what community was. So to experience it here in Heath, to the extent that I do. And then in Franklin County, it's just really, it's amazing. And I thank you all. Every one of you, I look at you, I mean, the people who I've seen all these years, it's 50 years now. It's amazing. Thank you.
I've got hearing aid problems. Right. So about 35 years ago, I also grew up in an apartment in New York. We got a bunch of refugees here. But we brought up our kids in a suburb. And about 35 years ago, Del said, I don't want to grow old in a suburb. And I said, great, we'll move back to New York. She says, no, we're going to the country. She had grown up in a small town in South Carolina. Anyway, and then she said, and I want an old house, and I want it off the road. 3.5 years later, we were still looking for this mythical house. And we had started in Vermont and ended up in Western Mass because our son, Steve, was living in Montague at the time. And we looked at another one of these houses that was decrepit, right on the road. And the realtor said, I have a listing in Heath. And I said, where in the hell is Heath? And he showed me on the map, and I said, it looks like it's in Alaska. Well, it's a nice day. And we were down in the valley, and we went up and up and up, and he took us through all the back roads. We got onto Avery Brook Road, and both Del and I felt something different, and that's really true. And then, when we saw this beautiful old house off the road, we bought it in the driveway. We didn't even go in. We knew we had found the house. Of course, it's a 1779 house, and the road to Coleraine was moved in 1830, so that's how we got a house off the road. And we showed up, we didn't know anybody. And as soon as we moved in, Newland and Carolyn Smith came up the driveway to greet us with, I think, some cake or something. And then the Garys invited us to something that we didn't know anything about, but as a Heath staple called a potluck. And introduced us to a bunch of folks, including Alistair Maitland, who made a speech about nobody plans to live in Heath. We all show up here by accident. And that was, of course, now with the internet and everything, you can find Heath, but back then it was really strange. And that's how we got started. And didn't take long for Eric Grinnell to say, how would you like to join Mohawk Trail Concerts? And then Bob Dane said, how would you like to join the Heath Planning Board? And that's where I learned how to ask people to join stuff. And it's been fantastic. And ever since Del passed, we have so many neighbors and friends who have been supportive of our family. And that's what Heath is. Thank you.
So it was 1986, and Jonathan and I were living on a farm in Cummington, and we were 22 and 25 years old, and we both had grown up in the suburbs. I north of Chicago, and he in Princeton, New Jersey. and we just graduated from college in the Valley, and we thought we died and gone to heaven. And we thought, you know, this is how we want to live, and this is the kind of place where we want to raise our kids. And we thought, maybe we ought to try to buy this farm. We didn't know, we had no idea what we were doing. And luckily, there were other forces at work, and the farm was sold to someone else. And we had no place to live. So we did what you did in those days, which is we contacted the local realtors who all had these rental books. And you'd go in and you'd look in these books, and we weren't ready to buy something else, so we'd look at all these rental books. And we saw this, what looked like this old house up in Heath, and it is an old house. And we had no idea where Heath was. We were down on the Mohawk Trail, and I think Mass One had an office on the trail at that point. And we said, well, why don't we take a drive up there? And we drove up, and it was Hosmer Road, and Richard and Marlene Hausner were there. And we knocked on the door, and we said, is this place for rent? And they said, Marlene just went the way Marlene did. Oh, you guys are the perfect people for this house, you know? And Richard was in the background nodding and nodding. Something else had fallen through that day for them. They thought they had renters, and then they didn't. And so they were, you know, their kids were going to go to school in Amherst, and they were going to rent in Amherst and then come back to Heath. So we fell in love with the community at that point, and we didn't have children. We spent 2 years up here. You know, Newland and Carolyn were our nearest neighbors, and Kip, their dog, would come over and visit, and the Sylvesters, and Elsa and Mike Bacalar, and it was such a lovely time. And then Richard and Marlene called and said, we want to move back. And John and I were really, really, really devastated, because we thought, oh, if we could only buy this house. And we looked around, and there wasn't anything else in Heath that we felt was right for us at that time. And then we went back to graduate school. So we were away for about 6 years, and then we got a call from Marlene, was Richard, saying, do you want to buy the house? And we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe it. And so we said, yes, of course. And we came back up to Heath, and that was 95. And, you know, it was just, it felt like a dream come true. And we'd been living in student housing down in the valley, and it just felt like we'd come home. And when we first moved up here, Gordon Caldwell, who in Cummington was the farmer next door, said, Heath, he said, that's God's country. He said, that's the closest thing to heaven. And, you know, and we've always felt that way. And, you know, when we got up here, we didn't know about the tradition of the Protestant theologians in Heath, but John's father said, well, I think that's where Riney and Ursula summered. And we said, what? And he had been at Union Theological in Princeton with Reinhold Niebuhr, and John's mother had babysat for Ursula, for the kids. And they knew other folks in Heath, and we had no idea of that connection, you know, at the time. And of course, I knew the Serenity Prayer, you know, and then I realized, wait, that church is the place where Niebuhr first delivered the Serenity Prayer. And but I thought, I don't have anything in common with those folks in the Heath Church. Nothing, you know, nothing socially, nothing theologically. You know, I never thought of this as a place to be. The school was a place to be. There were other places where I volunteered and felt, you know, held and connected, and where I could be of service. And then I started to really getting close with Ruth Johnson and a few other people here in the church, and Hilma. And I realized, you know, there's something here for me in this church. And, you know, I'm here because there are people who are very different from me in this church. And I could be at a church where people are preaching to the choir and where I hear everything that I agree with, and all the people have the same values I do and the same beliefs about God and the Bible that I do. But I don't want to be in a place like that. And I don't want to live in a community where I, think the same things and believe the same things that everybody else does. It's really important for me to be in a community where each of us can be ourselves and be connected to other people in love and in service. And what I'll say, to end is, I often think about, what am I going to feel like when I'm, on my deathbed? What's going to be really important to me? And I think about it's, how well did I love? How well did I serve? And what's my legacy going to be? And I imagine that, when it's my time, this will be the place, and you'll be there. But I just hope that that's my perspective on being here in this community and in this church and Franklin community at large. That for me it's about love and service. And if we can figure out a way to do that, continue to do that, I think that will be a tremendous blessing. So, thanks.
Anyone else? Mick, did you want to say a couple things?
Don't have another thing to say, except I want to echo that thing that people kept saying, this place grabs you and won't let you go.
I just wanted to say that,
Oh, Hilma's got.
oh, Hilma, go ahead.
Believe it or not, I really don't like to talk in front of people. I've just been in positions a lot in my life where I've had to, so it's like you grin and bear it. Sitting back there, at one point, I thought, gee, this is almost like we stand up one by one, and for me, I would say, hello, my name is Hilma. I'm a heathen. For those of you that don't get the significance of it, we are all here because we are addicted to Heath. There's many other places in the county, the state, the country, the world where we could go live. There's more beautiful places, perhaps, depending on what your idea of beauty is. We're here because Heath holds us. Now, for those of you that think you might know lots about me, and think of me as a native heathen, and I think of myself that way. However, I can also say with all honesty, I'm from away. However, the first time I came to Heath, I had no choice in the matter. I was 6 months old. My parents, my sister and myself moved from Charlemont because my father wanted to buy the Churchill family homestead, which is the home that I now own and live in. So I grew up in Heath. Heath has been the only home, in that sense, childhood home that I've ever known. It was a really, really safe environment for parents to raise their children in. You know, very, very few people in that day ever locked their doors. My house is 3.5 miles from Heath Center. I could say to my mother on a Saturday, I'm going to walk up to the library. Or I'm going to walk up to the library, I'm going to stop and get my friend Barbara, who was a mile up the road, and the two of us would walk to the library or ride our bikes to the library. She didn't worry. We took as long as we wanted, as long as we needed, and then came back home. One of the awesome things about Heath in that day, and even I think a lot of what like Sheila spoke to, is that if you were a parent or a grandparent, or in those generations, you raised the children of the community. You know, another thing I realized sitting there, I more or less grew up with Skip. But Mick and his wife Linda helped parent me. They were adults while I was a teenager. And they were two of the adults in this community that looked out for all the kids. Didn't matter who you were, where you lived, who you came from. And that stuck with me. He stuck with me. You know, not just my genealogical roots, I mean, they go really, really deep. My house was built in 1840 by my forefathers. It's always been owned by members of the Churchill family. That part of my heritage is really important to me. The Heath heritage is really important to me, and I believe it's all of that has enriched my life. But I've also gotten very conscious of the fact I chose to move back here. I lived away for 15 years. In those 15 years, when I talked about home, inside my head, it was always right here. It was Heath. You know, I had a dwelling I lived in, and that was home in one sense, because I abided there. This is where my heart always was. And I think it's the same for you folks, no matter how long it's been. I think it's the same for many others who couldn't be with us this morning. But I've begun to get very aware of how are we, the current generation of parents and grandparents, going to pass on our legacy to the next generation of heathens. I've also been very concerned because we no longer have a school to bring our young families, our children together. Our children are growing up as strangers, and it's like, how can we prevent that? How can we, as heathens with roots, draw together to set an example and to build opportunities for future generations of heathens to experience the same richness that we have?
Anyone else? When Mick and I were talking earlier, I mentioned in passing, and I've been thinking about this as I've heard all your stories. I can remember as a little child going to town meeting and hearing about this terrible thing, like we need to build a new town shed, and there was an uproar. The one down here is fine, it's been there for 100 years, and we don't need a new one, despite the fact that none of the machinery would fit in and so forth. So a big controversy brewed. And then it disappeared, and there was a new town shed. And I'm old enough to remember when the community hall was redone. And I don't understand why that needs to be redone. It's been good enough forever. And so that cycle has gone on, but and I could cite a lot of stories similar to that, but what struck me was I don't remember any of the solutions, not a one. I don't remember how any of it was resolved, and I didn't realize it until today. And you've told the story of how it was resolved with neighboring. There's a problem, there's disagreements, it's solved because we neighbor. And I just want to leave you with that thought. And thank everybody for taking the risk of coming and listening to two old gray-haired guys for a little bit.
Skippy and Mickey.
But then, yeah, Skippy and Mickey. What a picture. But really, you came, you told your story, and that's wonderful, and that's what's needed. So neighbor on. And there is coffee and refreshments downstairs. You're invited to join for that, for a little time of fellowship. Thank you. Thanks. Good job. Yeah, you too. Worked. Yeah.
Don't know for what, but.
Thank you, Bob.
You bet. Nice to see. Oh, good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So are we.
We were too, yeah.
Good. So Skip,